Gerard Manley Hopkins, he has quite an interesting life. He is connected to John Henry Newman, is he not?
Yes, he was actually received into the Catholic Church by Newman. So there's a very direct connection.
Hmm. So he was raised Anglican, I would assume.
Yes, he grew up in a totally sort of typical Anglican middle class family and had really a projected career of middle class Anglican brilliance as a scholar. He did
Hmm.
exceptionally well at Oxford. One of his professors called him the Star of Balliol. And
Hmm.
then he upset the whole apple cart by finding himself convicted that he needed to become a Catholic and join the Catholic Church. And so he was received into the church by Newman. And he was able to take his degree at Oxford because when he started, he was still an Anglican. Because even
Hmm.
at that time, all matriculating students had to affirm the 39 Articles. Um, and because he had started as an Anglican, he could affirm them. And he was able to finish because they didn't ask for an affirmation upon receiving the degree. So he squeaked through with
Interesting.
his degree in that last sort of window of um, of discrimination against Catholics at Oxford.
Which stopped not long after that, right?
Not too long after 1871 is the Universities Tests Act put an end to that, or at least put an
Okay.
end to the more overt forms of
Right.
it. It was still very difficult to be a Catholic at Oxford for many years.
How soon did he enter the Jesuit order after his conversion?
Pretty quickly afterwards, he gave a little bit of thought to becoming an Oratorian because of Newman's influence, but
Right.
pretty quickly discerned that it was the Jesuit order that was where his calling was, and served quite a long novitiate. Like they quite a long formational process. He served that in Wales, and in fact, it was during that time, during his Jesuit training, that he had this renewed sort of poetic inspiration
Hmm.
because it's interesting. It kind of goes against some of the stereotyped assumptions about, Catholics, Catholic priests, Jesuits, and what they think about literature. Hopkins himself, in a sort of fit of scrupulosity, had burned many of his early poems, thinking, I'm going to just dedicate myself to God, and that means not spending time in poetry. But when he was in the Jesuit training, it was actually his superior who encouraged him to take up writing poetry again. And with that encouragement, Hopkins was able to realize, okay, this isn't an either or. This is something I can do as part of my vocation as a priest. And the tension, of course, is, as for every writer with other responsibilities, finding the time. But from that point onward, when he wrote the Wreck of the Deutschland, that he felt that yes, this is something I can do as a priest, and it
Hmm.
was affirmed by his superiors there.
Now, you mentioned him being very brilliant. What were his more academic interests?
Well, he never really published anything academically. Which is part of why he was frustrated. He was a talented classicist. That's what he was teaching classics and philosophy,
I see.
Greek, Latin. Eventually, he was teaching that towards the end of his life in Dublin, and he wanted to do some commentaries and things like that. But he never really got anywhere with those. But we should remember he died when he was only 44, so
Hmm.
he died very young,
Right.
and had been suffering from poor health for years. So his brilliance is really what we have of it. We have it in the poems, which are just dazzling performances.
Right.
But we also see it too. We don't see it in the poems, but related to that is he had a keen artist's eye, and so
Hmm.
he also did many sketches, some of which you can see, and that eye for detail of the natural world is something that makes its way into the poems as well.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, so I seem to remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, I seem to remember hearing that he was so brilliant and the Jesuits didn't quite know what to do with him. So he kind of lived in obscurity to a certain extent after entering the Jesuit order. Is that correct?
He did, and they didn't quite know what to do with him, but he also didn't quite know what to do with himself in a
Hmm.
sense. He wrote the Wreck of the Deutschland, his first major poem, in a very fresh and new style, and with some new rhythmic approaches that he was working on, and it was at first accepted by the Jesuit magazine And then they said, well, on second thought, no. So they first accepted it and then retracted their acceptance. And so that was never published. And I think that left him a little bit ambivalent about whether his work was ever going to be well received.
Hmm.
He did make a few attempts to publish his poetry later on, because he did have his friend Robert Bridges, who became his literary executor, was attempting to set up some opportunities for him to publish. And he started that, but those fell through, and he never really followed through to make it happen. But again, he was ill, he was overworked, and he died when he was only 44.
Right.
And so if we look at the trajectory of his career, he had served as a priest in urban work. He was put into some slum parishes in Birmingham and Liverpool. He served briefly as the curate of St. Aloysius in Oxford, which is the same church at which J.R. Tolkien worshipped for a lot of his life. So he served as curacy in urban areas. He served as a priest in urban areas. And it turns out that he was a good priest. He was a good member of the team in those areas. He was he was himself very critical of his own preaching. And it seems that, at least in his preaching training, he didn't exactly wow his teachers and his classmates. So he was very hard on himself. And I think there has sprung up this idea that he wasn't any good as a priest, or he had no pastoral skills. But that's not really the case. It's not borne out by the more detailed records of his work. He wasn't a top-notch preacher, but he was dedicated to his work. He went and did it. He was part of a team of Jesuits working in these areas, and they saw that a better fit for him would be as a professor. So they moved him over to be teaching classics at the University in Dublin, which was a very difficult place to be working at that time. It was literally falling to bits. He probably died because of typhoid caught from bad drains, which is really grim. So the university buildings killed him, in effect.
Wow. Okay, so before we get into the poems, I'd like to talk about him as a poet a little bit more generally, and his importance as a poet. I mean, you mentioned he had this fresh style. I've always thought of him as a very musical poet, but a musical in sometimes more radical ways than previous, more traditional formal poetry, although he certainly is a formal poet. Well, I think it would be fair to call him something of a proto-modernist poet. Do you think that's accurate?
It's yes and no, but he certainly was a poet who was greatly admired by the early modernists, like Eliot, for instance. And I think the answer to that is in sort of his historical placement is very interesting, because he is technically a Victorian poet, but he does not fit the late Victorian poetic world very well. And that poetic world, by the end of the Victorian era, the late Victorian era, poetry was extremely popular, but it was also becoming kind of stultified. Poets were churning out just reams of versification that was, very pat, very trite, very same old, same old. And Hopkins is very different from all of that. He's working with traditional forms, like the sonnet is one of his primary forms, and that's a classic form. That's a very traditional classic form, but he approaches it with this vividness of language, with a sort of sometimes anarchic approach to syntax. His syntax is sometimes very fragmented. And I think that is perhaps what some of the modernists like Eliot in The Wasteland are seeing in him, because he is, in a sense, trying to cram so much meaning into every line that his syntax sort of breaks down under the effect of it. He's using words in new ways. He invents words. He reverses syntax. He omits words, and it makes sense. It's not that he's disrupting the reading experience so much that you don't understand it. He's very compressed. He can be very elliptical.
Right.
And so there's so much there. You have to work a little bit more to get at it than you do for the other late Victorian poets. So at the time, I mean, one can understand why his work didn't meet with immediate approval in his immediate cultural context. They didn't know what to make of him. But then the First World War happened. And in many ways, Hopkins, although he died before the war, his approach is so in tune with that, this shattering experience that breaks open every category of understanding the world. I mean, we
Hmm.
cannot overstate how culturally traumatic and shattering the Great War was. And now, at this point, his literary executor, Robert Bridges, brings out the selected poems in 1918. Bridges was a very good literary executor. He bided his time. He waited until he felt that there was an audience who might possibly understand his friend.
Hmm.
Brings it out, and it wasn't instantly a success, but it picked up greater and greater interest. And I think that moment was ripe for people to see, here is somebody who is understanding the raw nature of reality, of beauty and sorrow, and he's putting it in these poems, and that spoke to people in 1918, and it continues to speak to us today, I think, very, very powerfully.
Yeah, I'm currently learning Latin, and Hopkins' syntax kind of reminds me of the mixed up, word order in Latin. I mean, from an English speaking perspective, obviously. But yes, he is trying to cram meaning in there, but there also does seem to be like a musical element, almost as though the words are rearranged as to what will give a pleasing musical effect. And there's a very sonically dense and kind of crunchy feeling to his poetry, which is something that I always enjoy. Something that you almost might also find in, say, Dylan Thomas, in terms of like the density of the alliteration and all these different kind of just really packed in sounds that you kind of like have to be careful not to trip over when you're reading it out loud.
And it's interesting you made that connection with Thomas, because again, he's a Welsh poet, and Hopkins is very much influenced, I think, by his time in Wales. And I
Hmm.
think those the two poets, there's a lot in common there. I think in terms of that musicality, and I completely agree. Hopkins is a tremendously musical poet,
Yeah.
and I don't say much about this in the collection, but for specialists who are interested in Hopkins, I mean, his whole concept of sprung rhythm, where he's developing a new technique for expressing the natural rhythms of English language in his
Yeah.
poetry, that's something, again, I don't go into it in this volume, but that's an area that has been of great interest to a lot of people. But as an ordinary reader of his poems, we benefit from the fact that Hopkins himself paid very close attention to that musicality, to how the poems would sound when they were read out loud. And they
Right.
do reward reading out loud more than I think a lot of poets do. They really reward that.